Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery. I'm very excited to get to show this to you. This is an incredibly cool knife. This is the prototype for a brand new knife coming out from Vosteed. This is called the Ankylo. Now this is available right now through a Kickstarter, but unlike a lot of Kickstarters, this is actually shipping really soon. I think the ship date is like 2 months from now or something like that. The Kickstarter is still going on through May 6th, but if you're watching this in the future, you'll still be able to buy it. You just won't be able to get it at that discounted prices. I'll have a link down below for that Kickstarter. I have been very excited ever since I learned this knife existed because I'm a mechanism nerd, and this has a completely novel lock mechanism that they're calling the V-anchor lock. But whenever you encounter a new lock mechanism, you have to ask the question, is it actually good or is it just different? Because most people out there don't actually know how their knives work, and so they don't really care that it's working differently from others. They just need it to be a good lock. Luckily, I'll be able to show you in this video that this is actually a very solid lock. Like literally, this is a very strong, sturdy lock. And check this out. Ooh, that detent is so good. I want to give a huge thank you to Vosteed for sending this my way to be able to check out and show it to all of you. This is a prototype, so it's possible there's going to be small changes, but like I said, this is shipping very soon, so I'm pretty sure that this is actually much closer to like a production sample. And the entire box was fully sealed when it came to me, so odds are that this is just a kind of a random sampling that they gave to me and not like a perfectly tuned version, but as Nick always says, you have to assume it's the best possible version out there. Now, I'm assuming most of the people watching have never owned an axial button lock. In fact, many of you probably didn't even know this was a category of knife, because this is actually an extremely uncommon way of designing things. I'm only aware of 15 or 16 times in history that someone has attempted to design a knife in this style, and I've got, I think, 11 of them here to show you. I'm not going to spend a super long time in this, I promise, but I wanted to give you a brief history and a little bit of context so that you can understand why the V-anchor lock from Vosteed is fundamentally different from everything that came before it, and importantly, solves a lot of the issues that these earlier versions have. Now, the concept of using a pivot as the button for a button lock dates all the way back to the 1890s when George Schrade made the Press Button Knife Company. He was selling automatics, they were called fly open knives back then, but the concept is the exact same thing, it just has a spring in it. Now, I'm not aware of anyone attempting to do this again until 1975 when Paul Pullman created the Paul lock. And this is a really weird knife where the handle rotates around the blade instead of the other way around, but this was a very influential lock. And this knife kicked off a string of custom knife makers and a couple of production people too, attempting and eventually patenting their own implementations running up from the late 70s to the early 80s. There's two over here from Jimmy Lyle and D.E. Henry that I'm missing. I would love to have one. They're either very expensive or very hard to come by. We have a version of this all the way up into the early 90s and a weird straggler where Paul redesigned his initial lock in the late 90s. But this is generally what I would consider the first golden age of axial button locks. Now, it's important to remember that these were all designed before the era of one-hand opening knives. The idea of flicking a knife open simply didn't exist, and so a thing that all of these have in common is that they lock the knife in both the open and also the closed position. Back then, that would be considered a positive thing, but in today's day and age, that simply wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to flick it out. They all work fundamentally the same general way, where there's some kind of rotationally symmetric cutout in the blade and a similarly shaped peg that's being able to push up through that and blockade it. Pushing down on the button pushes that peg down out of the blade, allowing it to rotate. There are some exceptions. This one here were similar to one that's from Jimmy Lyle that I don't have, and these have like ball bearings rather than pegs, but same general concept. Now, Francis Boyd did update his designs and came up with two different patented mechanisms in the early 90s that would allow the knife to only lock in the open position. But back then, again, the idea of flicking a knife didn't really exist, and so there was no concept of a detent. Now, if you flash forward a whole 15 plus years after this one, almost actually 20 years after this one, you'll get Flavio Acoma's deadbolt lock. Now, this is the first time that a major production knife had an axial button lock that didn't lock in the closed position and you could flick open. This particular lock doesn't have any kind of intrinsic built-in detent. The detent on this is coming from the assisted opening mechanism, and the very first design ever to feature this lock actually had a standalone internal leaf spring with a little detent ball stuck on it. The way that this actually works is very similar to the way these old ones work, where there is some kind of cutout in the blade and some kind of pin that goes through it. It's just a really beefy externalized version of that. Now it still takes another 8 more years before we enter what is the modern golden age of axial button locks. There's actually 2 more here in this modern category that I don't have. One actually hasn't come to market yet. Jacob Lundquist from Kvist Blade Works created his own design. It's currently patent pending. And then there's another knife from Remet that's also an axial button lock. But the first one we have up here, this is from Defcon Knives. It's the exact same lock mechanism as you'll find in the Aurora Knives and Tools Truffle. Now, this mechanism is actually designed by the OEM itself, a company called Sikio, and it works completely different from all of these. There is no cutout in the blade with rotational symmetry, and there's no peg that's blocking it. This actually works like an inverted version of a liner lock, where this is a leaf spring, just like a liner lock. This is a lock face, just like a liner lock. For all intents and purposes, from a locker perspective, this is a liner lock. The difference is that the leaf spring is naturally resting in the flat position out of the way, instead of bent over. It's actually a little tiny lever arm inside here that's pushing it over. The lever arm is attached to the button, so when you push that, it's teeter-tottering the lever away, moving it out of the way and allowing the lock bar to flow back to its out-of-the-way position, allowing you to close the knife. The fact that this works basically the same as a liner lock means that you're finally able to have a good snappy detent in this. The problem with this is that it adds additional complexity, so that taking this apart is actually kind of complicated. There's a bunch of tiny little parts in here you got to get right. And it also means that the failure position of this lock, if that little spring were to break with the thing that attaches that lever arm to the leaf spring, this would fail into the unlocked position. Now flash forward to this year, and we've got the pivot lock from Riot. This is a really cool new mechanism that they put out, and it again works kind of similar to these, where there is a cutout in the blade and there's a pin that's pushing up into it to block it. And this one actually has a bit of a ramped surface on it, which means that this does have a built-in intrinsic detent. It's just not a very good one. This is, I mean, it works, you can certainly flick it open, but it's a pretty mild detent. And this is actually probably one of the most complex to take apart. There's a lot of small moving parts in here that are hard to get aligned, and they're different from the kinds of parts you would find in other lock mechanisms. So if you're only familiar with taking apart something like a liner lock, this might be over your head. And so that finally brings us to the V-anchor lock. Oh, did you notice what just happened there? Look at this. Ooh! So the way they're implementing this has a lock bar that runs along the entire length. It's kind of like the lock bar you'd find in a liner lock, but it's positioned in a totally different way and it's used in a totally different way. But they're able to put a detent ball on that, which means this has a detent very similar to the kind of detent you can find on liner and frame locks. And so it's nice and snappy. It's really, really good. Finally, for the first time, we have a solid detent on an axial button lock. And this is super big deal. We'll talk about this when we take the knife apart. The way that this fits together inside means that maintaining this isn't any more complicated than a standard liner lock. If you can take apart and maintain a liner lock, you can do that on this knife too. That's a huge deal. There's also 2 more things that this is doing compared to some of these older ones that I want to talk about that are a big deal when it comes to longevity. One is simply the fact that it has a standard stop pin. You might find that on something here too, but a lot of these older mechanisms don't have any kind of intrinsic stop pin, and something like this, it just uses the frame itself to blockade the knife, which means over time, this will wear not quite as well and will add a little bit of looseness. And that brings us to our second point. Most of these back here, I said, work on the idea of having some kind of cutout and some kind of pin that blockades it. Well, those 2 things are just mating with flat surfaces that rub against each other. There's no ramp built into them. The concept of a ramped lock face didn't really exist until the 80s, and it wasn't popularized until after that. And so as you wear these, while they're all pretty strong locks, they do eventually get some amount of play as those pieces rub against each other and form a little tiny gap in between. Over here on the V-anchor lock, we have an actual ramped lock face, the same kind of way that you would find on a frame lock or a liner lock. It's in a totally different position, and you're using it a different way, but it means that this will actually wear in and stay a tight lockup as you use it. So this is a much more durable and hard use design than a lot of these older ones. So it's really cool to see a mechanism that has a strong detent, easy to maintain, and is actually built to last. I think you can see why I'm so excited about this. Let's talk for a brief moment about the name. This is named Ankylo, Ankylo, and it's almost assuredly after the Ankylosaurus, one of the cooler dinosaurs. Some Ankylosauruses have like the big spikes along their back, not the Stegosaurus style, but all of them have a kind of a rigid back. The ankylo, there's actually a spinal condition in humans that has the same kind of ankylo at the start of it that I guess this could be named after. I doubt it. In both cases, it has to do with the Latin origin of the word, meaning stiff and fused. So like the dinosaurs have a fused outer shell. They're kind of like a reptilian version of an armadillo or something like that. And I think that's where some of the aesthetics is coming from here too. This looks a little bit like a tank, which is what those dinosaurs look like. I honestly think it's just an incredibly cool looking knife. I love the shapes here. So that's right off the bat, this is something that I genuinely think looks incredibly cool. I love the look of this blade. Actually, let's just start talking about this blade. This is not a particularly long blade. It's only 3.18 inches, but if that's scaring you off and making you think this is a small knife, it's definitely not. We're looking at about 7.75 inches overall length because this is actually a lot of handle on, a reasonable, this is all the blade you really need, but if you have big hands, you can still fit quite a lot on here. Like, I can fit all the way back here even. I can fit all 4 fingers on this spot. That's nuts. Anyway, so this blade is, I don't know exactly what this, this doesn't fall into any particular category. It's kind of a reversed hand to clippy point thing. It's kind of a sheep's foot. I'd say sheep's foot is probably the closest here, and this is one of my favorite blade shapes because it's just so incredibly practical. It's got enough belly that you can do a good rolling cut. If you're slicing through stuff, it stays in the cut really, really well. You can contact all points of this on the surface instead of just the tip, but the tip is so low down that oh man, is this a good knife for utility cutting. It is perfect for that. I also just think it looks really cool. I love the use of the swedge at the top. And importantly, the swedge does not thin this out so much that if you are using this in a pinch grip like this is still very, very comfortable. And you can even wrap up around this because it's not a super long blade and get right up to that tip if you want ultra control. Now the blade stock on here is 0.136. So this is not thick blade stock, but it's also not super duper thin. But we've got a tall enough grind. This is almost a full inch. But this is actually pretty darn good slicing geometry, and it does get nice and thin behind the edge. It gets about 18 to 20 thousandths behind the edge, which is plenty good for this to be a really, really nice slicer. When I was running it through standard cardboard, look, this is like from a Chewy box from dog food, look how clean that cut. Now I also pushed this through some of the stiff, dense cardboard because this kind of stuff doesn't like display, and sometimes thicker blade stocks like this will wedge on that. This didn't wedge at all. Look how nice and clean that came through. So this is still actually a really good slicing knife, but it's worth noting that this belly coming up like this brings you up further into the grind, which means that it is definitely thinner behind the edge down here than it is up here. We've actually got quite a sturdy tip. So this is the kind of thing where you're not having any risk of breaking this. This is not a tiny, dainty little tip. You can put a lot of force into that. And that actually is a theme that carries through this knife in general. This is a sturdy knife designed for actual use. But at the same time, everything is slim enough and light enough that still works great as an EDC knife. They did a great job with the plunge grind back here. So this is the plunge, the grind that takes you from the full thickness of the blade stock down to the thinnest behind the edge, and you can see it ends all the way up here, which means you have this entire vertical height of this choil here for you to be able to sharpen. So you're able to get a lot of life out of this. And that choil does absolutely work in a choke up spot. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the Ergos, but it's worth noting that they did knock this corner off right there so that even if you push up against it, it doesn't feel like it's going to puncture you at all. Along this top of the spine, we've got one of my favorite kinds of jimping. This is shallow jimping, but it's got crisp edges and it's got wide enough spots on the top that you can push really hard on this and it's not digging in your thumb, but it grips really, really well. We'll talk about the jimping more when we talk about the action and how it works for the various deployment methods, but for now, notice how far it comes out. That means that if you're choked back here, you're still touching it, but even if you're choked all the way up here, you're still on that jimping. And if you're in this kind of further back pinch grip, you're still on it right there. Now, I think it would have been kind of cool if it extended all the way up to there, but this is still plenty of jimping. Last thing I want to talk about the blade is this opening hole. It is perfectly rounded off and chamfered everywhere. There's nothing, if you're the type of person that likes to flick with your nail, it's not going to scrape you at all. If you're the type of person that likes to push with the meat of your finger, it still pops really, really well. It's a very, very comfortable flick. So overall, I would say this blade is thin enough with a tall enough grind that this is good slicing geometry, but it's also thick and sturdy enough that this is not a dainty knife. You could do some serious hard pushing with this, and it's not going to be a problem whatsoever. Oh, and for reference, this is an LMAX blade steel, and I think they said it's 60 to 62 HRC on that. That's pretty nice. Coming back to this handle, this is why this is not a small knife. We've got a 4.59, basically 4.6 inch handle length here, which means that if you've got much bigger hands than me, this will still absolutely fit you, especially since there is this additional choke up spot. So like I said before, with my medium glove size hands, I can cramp it down here and get completely behind this choil. I would never hold it like this, but I can. This grip here with this indexing spot, oh, that feels so good in the hand. In general, this knife feels really, really good. It is a flat slab knife. It's not contoured in this dimension, but it's got really significant chamfers on the outside that make it feel overall contoured because your hands do wrap around all of that. Now you can choke up and put your next finger in there instead, and you're still on this jimping right there. And technically you can choke up even further. I would probably do this. With my thinner fingers, I can kind of do that, but I think that's kind of an absurd way to hold it. But I guess you could if you really wanted to get up close to that. I'd say this grip here and this grip here are the most comfortable when it comes to these kind of thumb on the back of the spine, pushing a lot of force through. But the curve here fits perfectly in the hand for this pinch grip. It just nestles into that curve right there. Yeah, this is very, very comfortable. You can anchor against the little spot right there. Very comfortable in a pinch grip. You can, of course, choke up further or all the way up if you want. This is one of the nice reasons for having a choil right here is that your finger can wrap under here without being against the blade edge, but you can have your finger all the way up to the tip for getting really, really precise detail cuts. And I mentioned that there are chamfers on the outside that make it feel contoured, but there's also micro chamfers along the inside of everything, so there are no sharp corners or anything. This is a very clean, well-polished knife. The handles themselves are made out of aluminum. I don't think they say what kind, but I'm guessing it's 6061, and the powder coat finish looks and feels basically exactly like the kind of thing I'm gonna find on a ProTech knife. The handle feels very, very similar to that. We do have steel liners in here that add structural strength. Let's see if I can bounce some light up in here. There you go. You can see that there is skeletonization in both the aluminum part of the frame and in the steel liners themselves. And so they've worked hard to get the weight down on this, but I will say it's a little bit on the heavy side. It's 4.9 ounces. They quote it as 4.76. Maybe this is a difference between the production and the prototype, but it's at that weight where it's not actually heavy, it just is heavier than some things, like if you're used to like a really featherweight TRM. Similarly, the width on the handle here is 0.558 inches, so it's just over half an inch, which again makes it a hand-filling thickness without actually being a thick knife in your pocket. So this is the kind of thing that if you like a slightly bigger, slightly heavier knife, this is definitely going to appeal to you, but it's not so far in that direction that it should be off-putting unless you really only can handle that kind of TRM featherweight lightness. Now, importantly, the balance point on this is right there, which is basically perfect. So that weight is distributed really evenly across this. And since it is wider in this dimension, it fills your hand in a way that this feels perfectly balanced as you go. You can feel the weight in your hand, but it doesn't feel like it's like, you know, up at the tip or down the back. It's very evenly distributed. And since this isn't a terribly long blade, it's really easy to know where the tip is as you're working with it, even when you're back here in this kind of further back grip. Now, the only thing I would say about knowing where the positioning of the blade is that if you are choked back here, you have a pretty long distance to get to that blade, but it's really easy to choke up if that's a problem for the particular kind of cutting you're doing. Probably the only thing I don't like about this knife is the clip, but just aesthetically. Functionally, it works great. It's a deep carry clip with the recessed screws, so from a functional perspective, it's fantastic. It just is kind of blah and generic. It's their generic Vosteed clip, and as a result, it doesn't really line up, or can't really, it's not made for this knife, so it can't really line up with any of the aesthetics or appearances of this knife, the shapes going on, and so it just feels a little bit like an afterthought, but from a functional perspective, it's quite good. Now, the tip here could be pokey to some people. I don't actually notice it even when I'm choked back or if I'm choked up. It doesn't bother me, it doesn't dig into my hand, but I could see potentially these style of clips, sometimes people do find them pokey. The only thing I would say about this clip that kind of annoys me is I'm always frustrated on knives when it feels like you could mount the clip further up and use one of the clip screws as the body screw itself and have it just a little bit of deeper carry. On this particular design, exactly how it is, they couldn't do that. You can see that this has to sit below in order to have this lanyard tube. So if they tried to position this right up there, it would be blocking that slightly. But I feel like there's ways you could move around how things attach up here in a way that'd make that work. The other thing is, personally, I would just forego the lanyard tube altogether, but some people are lanyard people, so, more power to them. Now, aesthetically, having all of these screws here might be a little bit busy for some people if they want a really, really clean knife. It's worth noting that they do make a completely blacked out version where these screws are black and blend in a little bit better, but on that one, this pivot collar and the lanyard tube are both gold as like a fun little accent color. I personally can't decide whether or not I would want these to be black and blend in, or if I like them as kind of little pops to echo this little ring there and the other bits of silver on the knife. The screws themselves are actually really nice. They've got a little chamfer around the outside, and the inside bit is really nice and clean. So like this is good hardware. And the pivot collar is also nice chamfer around. It feels really good as you go around it. This back plate, we'll talk about how this works when we talk about how to disassemble it and everything later, but it's just kind of cool looking. This is in lieu of a standard pivot screw, and so we get these little screws here and this neat circle around the outside. It's just kind of cool looking. But if you are someone that hates screws, well, you do have two here instead of just one. Start talking about the action before we talk about how this mechanism actually works. Ooh, this has a really nice, crisp, strong detent. I would say it's actually strong. It's not too strong, but it is at least on the very firm side of medium, and it gives such a good authoritative thwack. It works really, really well for all the deployment methods. The one thing I will say is that this is the type of flipper tab that you have to pull back on and do like a light switch method, because if you keep your finger in the same spot, you will come around and hit this. So if you do a push button style, you're definitely going to blockade that. Let's just show what that looks like. Yeah. So as long as you do a more light switch and pull back, it's a nice authoritative one. And I love the fact that it is completely out of the way. It has jimping along the top right here. It also has jimping on the back. That's because this spot right there ends up right there and gives you a little bit of extra traction and indexing at the front of the handle. Now, the jimping on the top of the blade does not wrap up and over. I think it could benefit from having one additional jimping spot right there. The other thing I would say is that if you look at the spacing of this and the spacing of that, that's just wider than all the rest of these. So even if they're not going to do a jimping spot up there, I would want them to shift this up literally like half a millimeter just to make it look visually. But you don't need that extra spot up there for this to still work well. Like you could, I guess, slide off this, which is why it would be nice to have one more, but it's really easy to push your finger along the back of this and just snap it back. Now, this is the kind of knife where it's actually pretty easy for me to do that. I was surprised because this is a broader knife, and since I don't have super long fingers, sometimes it's hard for me to reach around knives like this and get enough of a traction in order to flick it out. Now, it's not the easiest in the world for me, but again, that's just a hand size thing. So if you have much bigger hands, it would work just fine. And it's rare on a knife that has a lot of deployment methods for them all to work really, really well. But look at that. Thumb flick is super easy. Reverse flick is super easy. Front flip is super easy. Back is super easy. They're all nice and crisp. It's hard to balance a detent to work well for all of them, but they all work really, really well. You'll also notice that on the closing, it just free falls. That's one of the wonderful benefits of having a button lock knife, because virtually all modern button lock implementations allow you to just completely relieve the pressure and the friction from the blade by pressing down on the button, which allows them to free fall. Now, this knife is actually doing something interesting. I don't know if this is going to be like this on the final production versions, or if this is just a prototype thing, but I'll show you what I mean. On most button locks, if you push this in, you're completely removing the pressure from the blade. Like if I let go of this partway through, now the spring pressure here is touching the blade and it adds friction. But if you take it off completely, it just free falls. But it's also this spring pressure that's acting as the detent in the bottom. So if you have this pushed in all the way, it'll just kind of bounce at the bottom. So if you don't want that bounce back, you have to kind of time the release, where I'm letting go of this pressure as it approaches the bottom so that the spring pressure can hold that in. If I don't, it'll just bounce. Now over here, I'm not really having to do that. Yeah, it doesn't bounce back. And the reason is because, well, when I'm in the open position, if I push this button fully in, the detent ball is completely pushed out past the blade and is not touching it at all, and it's just free fall. But when I'm in the closed position, right around here, the detent ball starts touching it again. And you can see there's actually a little bit of friction right there. It's touching it. In fact, it's being held into place. Normally on a button lock, if you just push this in, it'll free fall out, right? This one, if I push this in, it's stopping. So what's happening here is that in the closed position, the detent ball is still ever so slightly engaged with that detent hole, even when I push this all the way in. Now it's so slight that you can absolutely do the thing that button locks let you do, where you push this in and flick out the blade. It's really easy to overcome that if you want to do that. But it does technically hold it. And it does technically dampen it as it gets to the bottom. When we take this apart, I'll show you what's going on that's making that happen. And again, I'm not 100% sure if that's an intentional thing or not, or if that's something that's going to carry over past the prototypes. But if it does carry over past the prototypes, it's actually a pretty clever way of making it so that it doesn't bounce back at the end. I kind of really like it, and I kind of hope that it does stay this way on the final versions. Because like I said, you can still really easily do this, but it won't fall out if you don't want it to. Now let's finally start talking about how this mechanism works, because this is incredibly cool. Yes, functionally speaking, it's a button lock. There is a button, you push it in, and it unlocks the knife. But how they're pulling this off is totally different from how other people do it. So on a standard button lock, what you have is a little piston right there. There's a coil spring underneath it that's pushing it up, and you can push on the other side of it. You can see how it's thicker at the bottom. That's what's blockading the knife in the open and in the closed position. So pushing that in clears the path. You can now close it. And on the other side, there's a little bit of a ramp surface, which gives it a detent. But what's going on with the V anchor lock is actually a little bit more similar to a kind of a compression lock. See on a compression lock how there's a leaf spring bar. It's like you would find on a liner lock, but it's blockading the knife. There's this cutout right there at the back that is your like ramped lock face, and it's springing out in front of that and blocking it. Now this is a Spyderco smock that is unique in the fact that it has a button attached to that and turns the compression lock into a button lock. They don't normally work that way. And the V-anchor is kind of like this. It's actually the closest lock out there is probably the Brown lock on Craig Brown's custom FSD. This is one of the FSD minis. But if you look at this, you can see that there is a wedge cut into the middle of the knife. It's kind of more on the top here, but there's a ramped blade surface here, and then there's a spot for a bar to go out into. And if you pop this open, you can see that the lock bar pops into that space. That lock bar is actually a leaf spring in the center of the handle. And again, just like the smock, he's attached a button to it that allows you to push it out of the way. This is kind of how the V-anchor works. We've got a very similar gap right here where this is the gap for it to fill into, and there is our ramped lock surface. And then if we turn this around, let me bounce some light up again, we can actually see pretty easily what's going on in here. Oh, I'm probably gonna need to shine some light down in. There we go. So there is, on the inside of this, there's a leaf spring traveling down the center of the handle. And you can see that it's popping up into that little wedge spot. And if I push down on the button, you see how we're popping that out, pushing that down past the blade and clearing the gap. So this actually works kind of like if you took the Brown lock, shoved everything down towards the center, and then shifted it upwards so that the button can act through the center of the pivot itself. It's actually a really clever system. We'll take an even better look at this when we take it apart in just a moment. But what are the takeaways here? So you have the same kind of benefits of a button lock, where you get your fingers completely out of the path of the blade when it's closing, so it's safer, and just like the ease of use and fun of it. But you have the same kind of strength and rigidity of a liner lock, but the actual lock face is much, much thicker than a regular liner lock. So it's kind of more like a frame lock in terms of the actual locking surface. And it has a ramped lock face, like I mentioned earlier, that allows this to wear in over time. The entire lock thing is cut out of a really thick block of steel. And so it's a very robust lock. I've done no kind of structural integrity testing on it, but I would imagine that this is as strong as most frame locks out there. But with the added benefit of being fidgety and safer. And because they're attaching the detent ball to the spring itself, you're able to have the same kind of detent strength and positioning and everything as you would on a standard liner lock or frame lock, which means it can have that really, really snappy action with the added benefit of the button lock. So overall, this feels like a win-win-win to me. The only downside I would say to this style of implementation that's using a leaf spring is that you have to have somewhere for that leaf spring to go. And so for the same reason that liner locks tend to be thicker than frame locks, this is a little bit thicker so that you have travel space for that lock face to move out of the way. And that's why this knife is as thick as it is. But again, it's not actually a thick knife. It's just thicker than some things out there. Now let's open this up. You can see how you disassemble and reassemble this, and look at all the little details going on and how they actually pull this off inside. It's really cool. Okay, so taking apart the Ankylo is actually basically the exact same process as taking apart a regular liner lock, and that's a huge accomplishment. Most of these pivot as button lock type things get really complicated in how they're pulling it off up here, and so like if you've seen the new Riot version taken apart, this is way more complicated, and getting this all back together is way more finicky than a standard liner lock, and so it's not quite for the faint of heart. This, on the other hand, is literally the same process as a regular liner lock. So let's get started. All we have to do is take off the body screws. You can see that these ones in the center here are just holding the liners in, so we don't need to take those out. And then instead of a single pivot screw in the center, we can't have that because the button piston has to go up and down. We have two little pivot screws on the side, but otherwise it's the exact same thing. Now, I will say I'm a little bit annoyed that these are T6 and these are T8. I'd like them all to be T8. I don't love it when I have to use different screwdrivers for different pieces, but it's not a big deal. These two at the front up here are the exact same as each other, so you don't need to keep them apart from each other, but they are definitely different from the body screws, and so you want to keep them separated in general compared to these next two that we're about to take out. Now, on mine, this screw here is tightened down really tightly with this thing that's acting as the stop pin. And so for me, if I try to turn this side, the barrel turns and this side just backs out. It's a little bit annoying. On yours, it might easily come out or whatever. I don't love when I have to take out screws that are on the opposite side as the other screws that I'm working on. I don't like having to juggle back and forth. But like I said, on yours, it might not do. And if I really cared, I could probably hold this with pliers and make that side back out and then tighten this side down. Now on the back, either side came out for me, but since I'm working over here, I'm just going to take this out. And so, yeah, it's those 4 screws, and that's it. So at this point, if we open this up, this will just kind of wiggle apart. Come on. There we go. Yeah, so this is where all of the magic is going on. Oh, look, this is so cool. So we, on both sides, have these long liners that are attached in. That's adding structural integrity. But on this side, we've got this lock bar. And so this is very similar to a liner lock bar, except it's running in the center of the handle instead of down at the bottom. And our lock face, instead of being at the end up here, is actually this surface right here, that little bottom edge. And there's our detent ball. Yeah, look at this. So this thing here is just a little plate. You can leave it on. It's being held in with capillary action right now, but I'm just going to tap it out so you can see. It's just like basically a hubcap. And so that way you can see from the back, this is the part that's being pushed down by the button piston and moving our little lock bar there out of the way. Actually, let me see. Boing, 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 boing. That's fun. So technically speaking, you could tune this the way you would a regular liner lock too. We'd basically be bending this lock bar further out or back. I don't, at least on this one, I wouldn't bother messing with it. The detent is really quite nice. So moving over to the other side, check out the size of these enormous bearings. It's the exact same kind of thing you'll find on something like the PLXT. And the reason here is because the whole pivot structure in the center has to be made bigger so that there is a structural pivot, but then also a thing that can move in or out. So this is a very strong block right here. And as a result, they've had to move everything out and make these really quite big, well, it just fell out, but these quite big bearings. So you definitely aren't going to be able to swap skips in here. I wonder if it's the same size that's in here, because these also has really big ones. Probably not. In fact, I don't know what size this corresponds to. This pivot it doesn't line up cleanly to either metric or imperial. It's a little bit less than 17/32 inch, and it's a little bit less than 13.5 millimeters. I don't know exactly, but there are 14 balls. And one of the really cool things about having really wide bearings like this is that your structural base, like the lever arm distance from the center here to where these detent balls are, is way further out. And so it gives you way more structural integrity from a lateral perspective. Okay, so this is the actual pivot. It just dropped out at the bottom. I'm not sure if you can disassemble this more than it already is in a way that's not destructive. I'm not sure how they're putting it together in the first place, but there's no need to take this apart further. That's the little brass pillar in the middle. There's the little N52 magnet. We'll talk about that in just a sec. And that's the outside bit. You can see it Yeah, that's fun. Those two screw holes right there are what the outer screws came in when we took the pivot out. You can see that this is a captive pivot. This giant thing is captive because it's squared off on this one side. And on this side, you can see there's a little squared bit in there. So I'm going to put this back in here real quick, and then let's talk about how this lock is actually working, because this is just really freaking cool. So on a standard liner lock, your lock face is right here, and the lock bar is abutting against it. And so when you try to close the knife, that lock face is pushing against the lock bar. It's oriented in a vertical orientation, and it's pushing against that lock bar and trying to compress that lock bar into itself. And that's what's preventing the knife from closing. Here, what we've done is swung that lock face up 90 degrees so that it's now oriented horizontally. I'm gonna take this back out again and let you see this. So this side, that's cut straight up and down, but this is our ramped lock face. And it's ramped the exact same way it would be on a liner lock. It's just oriented vertically instead of horizontally, or I guess horizontally instead of vertically. Yeah, so this right there is the part that's making lock face engagement. Yeah, look at that. Anyway, by changing the directionality of our force, it's no longer compressing the lock bar into itself. Instead, what it's going to be doing is applying upward force against this bottom side of this little lock bar right there. When this goes into place, it's this surface right there that is touching that ramp surface right there. So as you might know, it's a lot harder to compress a lock bar into itself than it is to flex a lock bar when it's a long stick like this. And so this is the same concept that's going on in a compression lock, for example. In fact, rotating the lock face up 90 degrees is the exact same way a compression lock works too. The way that they prevent the lock bar from flexing upward in the compression lock is by putting a stop pin directly above it, and you're compressing the lock bar against that stop pin. That's where it gets its name. We're doing a very similar concept here, but instead of a stop pin, it's this nub that's worked into this insert plate here. Now this is pretty thick piece of steel right there, so it's very, very strong. And this little nub is so incredibly close to this that this can't really flex up at all without touching it. Now it's important to note that it's not actually touching it right now, so that you can still move this in and out without having any kind of friction there. But it takes such an incredibly small distance to hit that this bar basically cannot flex upward whatsoever. It's not perceivable whatsoever. It's basically touching it instantaneously. And so because these are separate plates from each other, this piece right here is actually milled out of a very thick piece of material. Like the entire thing was originally as thick as, let's see if I can give you a good angle, this piece down in here. So it goes all the way deep into there. And so basically this entire thickness of this nub is abutting against this piece of bar right here. And so it's a big chunk of metal pressing up against a big chunk of metal. This is actually a very strong lock. You would have to destroy this entire frame for this to break. Okay, so let's talk about where this magnet comes in. Actually, the wording of how they explain the magnet has always been a little bit confusing to me. They give basically two reasons for why this magnet is here. One of them is exactly what makes sense to me, and it's basically that this magnet is going to hold the button, that's at the end of the button piston. It's going to hold that against this and make it not rattle about. And it's also going to make it so stay tucked in, so it's not sticking out when the knife is closed. The other reason they give doesn't quite make sense to me. I'm going to quote the Kickstarter page right here. They say the N52 magnet connector and the thick lock plate, I guess that's that piece, form joint forces to stabilize and reinforce the lock. No matter whether the lock is engaged or not, there will always be contacts among the three parts. I guess the third part being this pivot cage part, I don't know, thus creating an integral fail-safe system. I have no idea what that means. I can't think of a good reason why this magnet being here would make this somehow fail-safe or safe in what kind of failure. Like if this lock bar were to just entirely snap somehow, which would never happen, like there's never going to be a force on this that would be a snapping kind of force. Having the button pull, I don't understand how that would impact a lockup in any way. So to me, I don't see this magnet as like a fail safe in any kind of way, but it is a very clever way of keeping the button attached to this lock bar, which eliminates rattle and also keeps the button tucked in and out of the way when it's in the closed position. Other folks put some kind of spring in there. Like on this one over here, they have a separate spring right in there. That's all it's doing is holding tension against this so that it doesn't rattle. It's basically making it so that it sticks right about there. You can feel a tiny bit of wiggle. But yeah, there's a tiny weird little spring inside. It's just a clever way of getting around doing that. So you can see that when I start to put this back in, that magnet is strong enough it's going to attach to this. This is an N52. That's the strongest class of magnets you can get. And so I don't know if you're going to be able to see it pop up. Oh yeah, it just attached. So putting this back together is really straightforward. We just kind of push everything down. These back pieces, like this barrel spacer, just kind of pop into place. And we're just going to put our screws back in the reverse order. But before I do that, I want to talk about one more thing. And as I said, how when it's in the closed position, that the detent ball is ever so slightly touching in a way that it doesn't actually fall out. So I was really surprised to see what's going on here. So for it to clear cleanly and have zero friction free fall when you're unlocking it, it means that the ball is not touching over here, but it's barely being held in place over here, which means it is touching over here. The only way that that can happen, when I'm not changing where the location of the ball, the only way that can happen is to change the thickness of this plate. I was not expecting that to be the case. I would expect this to be the exact same thickness right here as it is right here, but it's not. It's actually slightly thicker right there than it is right there. I don't know if this is just a side effect of this being a prototype. It might not be like this on yours, but I measured this and it's very close. But here, check this out. Down here, let's get this into inches. We're at 0.1365, and over here, we're at 0.138. So that's 1.5 thousandths of an inch difference, and that's really, really tiny. But that's enough for the detent ball to be completely clearing on this side and slightly held in place and slightly making friction on this side. Again, I have no idea if the actual production version is going to be like that. I'm really quite surprised that this isn't completely flat and is a ever so slightly bigger ramp right there, but that is technically what's going on. It's thicker right there than it is right there. Okay, let's put this thing back together. Just slide this back down like I mentioned before. Pop everything into place. Let's put our screws in. I have found that on this knife, it doesn't particularly matter what order you put these screws in, except for the fact that you want to put the body screws in first. Tighten that down all the way. Tighten that down all the way. Now, this is fun. You can see as I push in on this button lock, you can see it actually pushing that lock bar out of the way. It's neat that you can actually see this angle. It's cool that this is exposed. But we just need to put this little plate back down on top, align it so that the screw holes are showing through, and then we just need to put these in. Now, just like on a regular liner lock, you can tune your pivot here, but instead of tuning a single screw, you're basically tuning the amount of pressure on these two. And that might make it sound more complicated, like maybe it'd be harder to balance the tension between both of these. But in my limited experience, it's not really been any different or any more difficult. Basically just tighten these down, get it slightly tight. Okay. And check your action. Okay, so this is a little bit snug right now. Let's see, maybe I can tune this just here. Okay. There you go. Do I have any play? Nope. That is super bang faulty. Ugh. See, that's tremendously easy to do. And seriously, I want to stress this one last time. These pivot as button lock knives typically are really complicated to take apart. The fact that this one is so easy to take apart is a huge, huge selling point, because this means that average people that are used to maintaining just standard knives are already going to know how to take this apart and how to maintain it. It's no different. There's no special tools you need. There's no special like fidgety with stuff. You don't have to align anything real carefully. There's no weird getting springs in. You don't have to understand new parts. These are all the same things you're used to doing already. Seriously, again, huge deal. Okay, so my final thoughts on this, honestly, is that I really love this knife. As a mechanism nerd, the fact that this is mechanically different from everything else out there is really exciting to my brain. But as a knife lover and just like a practical tool lover, this is legitimately a really solid knife. Overall, I've used this a fair bit to try and test this out, and I just love the way it feels in my hand. Choked up and choked back, these both feel so incredibly good. And this knife really is an excellent cutter. And it's just dang fun to play with. Yeah, I've been really enjoying this. I think it's a very compelling offering. And so while I'm someone that tends to really love very thin, small, lightweight knives, and this is slightly on the bigger, thicker, heavier side from what I tend to go for, this is still very comfortable in the pocket, very easy to carry, and very fun to have on you. So I've been honestly really loving this. I think this is definitely worth checking out. I'll have a link down below for where the Kickstarter is. It runs till May 6th. And the price on these, in the retail price, is $169, which is honestly a really good deal. But if you get in on that Kickstarter, you can get it for $10 off at $159. And like I said, the ship date on these, I think it's at like June? So it's going to be coming really soon, so don't worry about the fact that this is a pre-order. I've been absolutely loving this, and I think you'll get a big kick out of it too. Hope you all enjoyed this, and I'll catch you all next time.